Means sit down and be quiet, Laurie. Please.
No, Patty's the one you should be giving the high time to.
This is her first day
Oh, I see. I see. I don't know. I kind of enjoy watching him smile. Janine, are we broadcasting to the world? The mics are on now. So they're not. They're just ignoring me when I ask them to sit down and be quiet, huh? Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. If I could have your attention, Ms. Schwartz. It's not turned on. Maybe Timothy's had a stroke. Do you have any numbness on any side of your body, Tim? No, not really. Yeah, it's on. God, it was working before. You were just fooling with me, weren't you? Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Tuesday, May 15th, 2012. For those of you that have been following this series, today is probably the second to the last episode of Charlie's Angels, because there will be a new sequel coming along. Charlie and his Angels and two others. So if you're following this, you might want to remember this.
So you don't consider Felicia an angel?
Well, I said two others. She has to prove herself to be an angel. With that, I would like to call this meeting to order, since that wasn't an official comment. Is that okay, Mr. Lawford? I would like to...
I want to be the smart one, Fran.
No, I don't have a poster of either of them on my locker in a bathing suit. I will begin by introducing my colleagues, as long as they will let me. To my left, Vice Chair Francis Spivey Weber. To my right, Board Member Tam Doduk. Mr. Howard, would you please introduce Karen Turkovich and the rest of your staff, please?
Yes, I have, let's see, Karen Turkovich and John Bishop, our chief deputies, Chief Counsel Michael Lawford to my left, and we're assisted today by Janine Townsend, clerk.
Thank you. For those of you that wonder what in the world I was saying, apparently Ms. Townsend and Ms. Turkovich have had some kind of a spat, because her name wasn't included on our roster for a couple of months there, and she was feeling kind of left out, so I wanted her to know that we appreciated her very much. With that, to the back of the room, there are two exit signs. If you do hear an alarm go off, in all seriousness, if you would evacuate the building down the stairs, and you're now able to go to the recently refurbished Chavez Park and wait until the fire department has finished their work. If you are going to speak today, please identify yourself clearly and whom it is you're representing, if not yourself, because the meeting will be webcast and recorded. Also, if you would, all your electronic devices that keep you in touch with the outside world, if you could put them in neutral, I would appreciate it very much. With that, in every meeting we have an opportunity for a public forum for members of the public to speak to the board about matters that are not pending before us. I do have one card if anyone else would like to speak. If you would give a card to Ms. Townsend, certainly we would love to hear from you. O'Loughlin? Mr. O'Loughlin, what in the world would you want to talk about that's not pending before us? I'm curious. I can't really wait.
Can't wait. Tim O'Loughlin, San Joaquin Tributaries Authority. I rise today to talk about process. What?
Center up on it. That's not a very good microphone, Tim. I know we
No,
joked
it's
about
terrible.
microphones
Is
earlier.
that better?
Yeah, that's good.
Originally, when the State Water Resources Control Board was moving forward with the San Joaquin River Basin planning process, the SED, basically the functional equivalent document, was going to come out in March. We were going to have a comment period, and then the State Board was looking to have workshops sometime in June. That schedule has slipped. We wrote when the SED, when that notice came out, that given the breadth and extent of the documentation that we expected to see in the SED, that we wanted at least a 60-day period and maybe 90 days to comment on the SED. So I rise, and this is kind of a quasi process thing, and it's personal to my office. We have issues going on in the office this summer. We have a due date for one of us on July 15th. We have a wedding coming up, so in July as well, with a honeymoon associated with it. So we got issues in July. But I want to kind of know what the process is going to be as we move forward. And one of the things I'm concerned about is it's now almost the end of May, and you have workshops coming up in August, and I don't want to get involved in whether the workshops are included in the phase one or aren't included in the phase one, and what the record will look like. I don't want to get jammed, basically. I don't want the SED to come out, get us 45 days to respond to a document that your staff has been working on for 3 years, and then turn around and have workshops just because you can jam it in between now and the first part before those workshops occur in August. And we've met with your staff. We've gone through some, the appendices that you sent out on the street early on were helpful. We've commented extensively to your staff on those appendices. But based on the comments that we've made to your staff, our belief is that there's a lot of work yet to be done with the SED, because some of the modeling that was done both for the baseline and for the impacts analysis had some issues. So I rise basically for process. I want to know what the timeline looks like.
I'm going to turn this over to Mr. Howard, who is more attuned to that, Tim, than I am.
Okay.
Well, at present, we're looking at a release around mid-July of the SED, is my belief right now. We haven't decided on the schedule for the comment period. The minimum allowed by law is 45 days, so it would be at least 45 days. And I would have to go and talk to the staff about what the rest of the schedule looks like after that. So I can get back to Mr. O'Laughlin with more detail if that's what the board would like.
If you could, Tom, and to all of us, I mean, I think I'm being unusually sympathetic about weddings and birthdays and bar mitzvahs and babies and all that, but, you know, there is certainly merit to the concern that, you know, we've been growling on this for 2 or 3 years, and to have a relatively short comment period, I don't think would be right. So if you would kind of go over it with staff, and we will get back to you, Tim, and I'm not saying that to try and placate you.
Oh, no.
We will.
Just that alone gives me assurance. The main thing I wanted to hear was when the SED might be coming out. And the mid-July is great, and we can work on everything else after that. And in regards to that, we owe your staff one more modeling run on New Maloney's, and my understanding, Dan Steiner's done with his surgery, so your staff will be receiving that, which is a baseline run of how New Maloney's currently is operated. So that should be going to your staff this week.
I can just say that, you know, we have enough challenges ahead of us on both sides of this issue that I would take no satisfaction in trying to jam you
No.
in a short period of time. But, you know, we do have a schedule we need to meet, and
Absolutely.
And your staff person has an opportunity, if the SCD comes out right about the birth date, you know, maybe if it's a
I'm
boy,
sure she's
you
gonna
name it
love that,
Charlie.
Fran.
I don't
You'll
know.
be sitting at home with a newborn reading your SED. Boy, that sounds like double fun.
Yeah.
I'll tell her you said
if that doesn't cause postpartum depression, I don't think anything in the world ever would, to tell you the truth.
Well, thank you very much for your time, and thank you for the information, and we'll get those other model runs to your staff.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you.
This time I would like to ask my colleagues if they have anything to report. Obviously, I have reported to you, I guess in my way, that we do have 2 new board members. I don't think that's any secret. We have both Felicia Marcus and Stephen Moore, who will be joining us sometime in the month of June. Both of them are certainly gainfully employed and are giving ample notice to their employers before they join us, but it looks like it will be sometime in the month of June. We'll be looking forward to that. I'm sure all of the angst and the year and a half or so that their names have been in the docket have provided relief from them. We're certainly anxious to have 2 new board members, and you know, I personally will be looking forward to that, as I believe my colleagues will. But do either of you ladies have anything you would like to say? We have an uncontested item in item number 3. You have no cards in that, Ms. Townsend?
Mr. Chairman, I'll move that item.
Second.
Those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Thank you. Mr. Howard, should you introduce item number 4, please?
Yes, item number 4 is a basin plan approval the board needs to do for the Lahontan region. They intend to replace their region-wide pesticide water quality objective with a region-wide pesticide waste discharge prohibition with exemption criteria. And Laurie, I think, will be the person presenting, the AEO from Region 6.
All right. Good morning, Chairman and members of the board. My name is Lori Kemper, and I'm the Assistant Executive Officer with the Lahontan Regional Board. And first, I'd like to introduce our new Executive Officer who's here today in the audience. Patty Kuyumjin began work yesterday. So Patty is the new Executive Officer of the Regional Board. Richard Booth is also in the audience. He's the senior in charge of our TMDL and Basin Planning Unit, and Kim Niemeyer is our legal counsel. But today, the presentation will be done by Dan Sussman and Mary Fiore Wagner. They're the project managers of this effort, and they've been involved with this for over a year, and they'll be making the presentation on this item.
Good morning, Board Chair Hoppen and members of the board. I'm Mary Fiore Wagner, an environmental scientist with the Lahontan Regional Board in the TMDL and Basin Planning Unit. And today, myself and Dan Sussman, also an environmental scientist with Region 6, the Lahontan region, will present the approval or recommend approval of an amendment to the Lahontan Basin Plan. The amendment replaces a very unworkable pesticide water quality objective with a waste discharge prohibition with exemption criteria to allow appropriate uses of aquatic pesticides. Pesticides in this amendment is an umbrella term which includes compounds applied at a lethal dose. Examples, lethal doses to control pests, that is. Examples include herbicides, pesticides, or fish toxicants, and larvicides commonly used to control disease-carrying mosquitoes. And though there's been a lot of attention to the Lake Tahoe region with this amendment, I do want to note that the amendment applies to our entire Lahontan region, which includes all of California east of the Sierra Nevada crest, extending from the Oregon border south to the San Bernardino Mountains. In preparing the amendment, we provided ample opportunities for public involvement throughout the Lahontan region. In compliance with CEQA, we've held 3 CEQA scoping meetings in our north and southern regions, and that was in July of 2009. We also met with numerous stakeholder groups, environmental groups, water purveyors, resource conservation districts, and we also circulated the amendment for 2 comment periods with the regional board, and we received 16 comment letters during the first comment period, 4 during the second comment period. Each of those comment periods were in excess of 45 days. We also hosted 2 public hearings, one in Lake Tahoe and a second in Victorville, and those were before the December 2011 board hearing where our board considered and then adopted the amendment and the substitute environmental document. After adoption by the Lahontan board, then the amendment was circulated again during the State Board comment period, public comment period, and that we received 65 comment letters. And for the record, there were no EO corrections or change sheets to this item. The amendment replaces the former water quality objective that was not working in our region. It was a de facto prohibition, and it largely solves a regulatory issue that has existed in our basin since the 1970s. The amendment replaces a non-detect water quality objective that precluded the Water Board from permitting legitimate uses of aquatic pesticides necessary to meet environmental management and protection needs. The amendment's prohibition of pesticides in water now includes the ability for a project proponent to request an exemption for certain circumstances. Circumstances that are eligible for an exemption can be categorized into two broad categories, either as projects conducted for purposes of public health and safety, or those conducted for purposes of ecological preservation and restoration. Now, it's important to note a lot of projects that would fall into the public health and safety category are currently occurring throughout our region, though they're technically in violation of the existing water quality objective with a non-detect. So for these circumstances, vector control and also water purveyors throughout our region that are trying to meet their legal mandates to protect public health and purvey safe drinking water. In effect, the amendment will bring these applications into our regulatory purview, and we will protect water from unintended impacts. The second category addresses the existing and emerging threat of aquatic invasive species. It also addresses endangered species recovery and fisheries management, both of which in our region are circumstances that often fit into the existing rote-known variants. This amendment updates the current rote-known language, and it refines the existing control measures for rote-known projects, and it also bolsters up the monitoring requirements, especially for non-target species. If an exemption is granted, we would regulate the discharge with a permit. Most likely that would be under one of the already established State Board general NPDES permits for aquatic pesticide discharges. And that would be unless the Lahontan Water Board determined that an individual permit may be more appropriate to regulate the discharge. So in considering the exemptions, we knew that a cookie-cutter approach would not work. So the amendment takes a tiered approach depending on the scope, scale, and the urgency of the project considered. The first tier, the exemptions are granted. And here, the Lahontan Water Board acknowledges the importance of protecting public health for projects involving vector control, as well as the immediate need required when responding to a governor-declared emergency. So for these limited circumstances, the exemption is granted within the amendment and no further action is required by our board. For the next tier, this would be the time-sensitive projects, we recognize the sense of urgency and provide the project proponent with a response after a 10-day public comment period. If allowed by the executive officer, the project proponent may demonstrate compliance with criteria after project implementation. And then for all other projects, the project must demonstrate compliance with all exemption criteria prior to that project being considered before the board. Exemption requests in this tier must demonstrate that the project proponent has conducted due diligence in considering non-chemical measures cannot work to meet, they're not feasible in meeting the intended effect. Now Dan Sussman will highlight some of the public comments and concerns that we received and how we responded to those
Dan,
comments.
before you start, I have a question of our staff, if you don't mind. Tom, you or Michael, if you would refresh me, when Fish and Game had the issue at Davis Lake and they needed to, they didn't use rotenone, but they used a similar product that they thought had greater efficacy. They actually had to come to us for an exemption and a permit. Could you articulate for me and refresh my memory as to why they did that instead of following what would be protocols underneath this the Basin Panel Amendment?
Well, the example that you're referring to is actually in the Central Valley region.
No, I realize that.
So they don't have in their regional board a similar prohibition, that, or I should say a similar water quality objective that has effectively made it non-detect. So initially, the state board had to do some of the issuance and had to do, I can't remember the exact reason why we ended up with it. And then subsequently, the regional board had handled the reissuance of that NPDES permit, and then we did see a petition up to the state water board on it.
But given a hypothetical that hopefully never happens, I mean, that was very controversial, certainly in many sectors. It was very graphic, quite frankly, when I was there when they killed all the fish in that lake. If a situation like that arose in the Lahontan region, and obviously there would be people that were for it and people that were against it, would it be on the entirely on the shoulders of the regional board, given this proposed Basin Plan amendment, or would there? I mean, how would you envision? I'm asking you a hypothetical that
Sure.
certainly we all hope doesn't ever happen. But
There has been something similar, the Silver Creek endangered species protections that the Department of Fish and Game undertook with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Region 6. And it's important to appreciate that those types of projects undergo a very significant environmental review, in that particular case under both the National Environmental Policy Act as well as the California Environmental Quality Act, because the species agencies, if you will, again, in that case, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Department of Fish and Game, are the project proponents. And so they really carry the laboring oar. Ultimately, for the NPDES permitting, they do have to circle back to the regional board. And in the case of I think it was Silver King Creek, the regional board issued the NPDES permit and kind of threaded the needle on that. And so, they will continue to have some responsibility for implementing their basin plan and issuing the NPDES permits, but they're informed by environmental documentation from the Resources Agency, which is quite extensive.
thank you for that explanation. Daniel, sorry to interrupt you, but that was an important question for me.
Yes, thank you. Well, as Mary mentioned, I'm going to address some...
Is your microphone turned on?
There we go.
Yeah.
Thank you. As Mary mentioned, I'm going to address some of the comments and responses that we've received. And as you may guess with this topic, it was really a challenge when crafting the amendment to be all things to all parties. But we feel that we feel satisfied with our efforts towards that end. One comment that resonated throughout both the regional board comment period and the state board comment period is that Lake Tahoe is a special place, and it should be afforded more protection than many of the other water bodies. The commenters felt that Lake Tahoe, as an outstanding national resource water, should be explicitly excluded from exemption eligibility. In other words, provide Lake Tahoe the highest level of protection it deserves, and don't allow any aquatic pesticide uses in the lake for any reason. Or if the amendment fails to exclude Lake Tahoe, to instead limit the circumstances where aquatic pesticides use may be allowed. So vector control, and in response to a first introduction of a really insipid aquatic invasive species such as quagga or zebra mussels. So we took this to our board and sought direction from them, and our board felt that the protections that are inherent in the amendment's exemption criteria, coupling that with board discretion when considering any exemption request, were really protective enough of Tahoe, and they felt comfortable
Daniel,
with
if you
that.
could center up on that microphone, it's not horribly sensitive. We can make sure we hear.
Yeah.
Good, thank you.
So we took this concern to our board, and the board really felt that the protections in the amendment, coupled with their discretion in hearing exemption requests and considering them, whether to grant or deny them, were protective enough of the lake. And they didn't really not want to exclude or limit the scope of the projects in Lake Tahoe. I want to say it's worth mentioning that some individual board members actually felt strongly that Lake Tahoe should not be excluded because we needed the exemption ability in case this outstanding national resource water was threatened by a biological pollutant. We also heard concerns from recreational water users, agricultural interests, and water suppliers. Both board and staff agreed that we could meet these concerns by bolstering the elements of the project that provide protection to water users. And this was largely accomplished through a strong disclosure of project details and through solid notification and communication plans. Under the amendment, the project proponent is responsible for notifying potentially affected parties of potential effects to any beneficial uses. And notification would include use restrictions and recommended water precautions, including providing an alternative water source if need be for drinking water users. And for projects proposed for Lake Tahoe, protections are ramped up a little bit more. Project proponents are required to consult with water purveyors during the development of projects that may affect a water source. And this allows more upfront engagement with the intent of minimizing or even preventing the impacts to resource waters. So water purveyors can be involved with the project design, mitigation measures, and monitoring before the project is even brought to the board for consideration. Finally, the Lahontan region includes a number of water bodies that are shared with or flow into Nevada, and not just Lake Tahoe. The amendment requires consultation with the Nevada Division of Environmental Protection for projects that could affect waters of Nevada, and also consultation with California Department of Public Health for projects that may affect surface drinking water intakes. And then we did receive a number of letters, comments, and as well as public testimony at our Lahontan board meetings in support of our amendment. These came from the Tahoe Keys Property Owners Association and their members. The Nevada County Board of Supervisors submitted a resolution, as well as the Tahoe Resource Conservation District and the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency. So to comply with
Actually,
CEQA
Dan,
Yes,
before
ma'am.
you move on to CEQA, could you take a moment and provide some information for me on your responses to comment 1.3 and 1.4 from CASA TriTech? It has to do with potential trace of pesticides in POTW discharges. I think you did a great, staff did a great job in the responses to comment. That was the only one that I felt was a bit lacking.
So comment 1.3, these are from the California Association of Sanitation Agencies and TriTac. And 1.3 is they were concerned with the new discharge prohibition and how it will adversely affect publicly owned treatment works, which may discharge trace amount of pesticides.
And your response simply is that the permits currently do not require for monitoring of pesticides, and that they should continue to monitor for priority pollutants, and as a result of that, in the future, that might be additional monitoring requirements placed upon them.
Yes, and the board reserves its just enforcement discretion when dealing with those. It's interesting to note that there are other pathways that pesticides could enter into their sanitary water, both from folks that pour stuff down their drain, or pesticides that are required to have labels under the Federal Insecticide and Fungicide and Rodenticide Act include such simple
I understand
containers.
that.
Yeah.
And then moving on to 1.4, your response there is, should there be a toxic level of pesticides concentration in their discharge, the regional board would exercise your enforcement discretion. My point is, it doesn't really address, I think, the POTW's concern of, well, I guess Ms. Larson can speak to that concern of potential being subject to potential, other types of enforcement action, given the prohibition being in place and given that they may have traces of pesticides in their effluent discharges.
Right. I'm going to pass this one off.
This is Lori Kemper, for the record, Assistant Executive Officer. It's true that if we found trace amounts of pesticide in their effluent, or actually it would have to be in the groundwater or in the surface water. And I want the board to recognize we only have 2 MPDS dischargers of municipal effluent in the Lahontan region. So one is in Susanville and one is in Victorville. And those are the only 2 that actually discharge to a surface water. So those are the only ones that would be subject to MIGDN mandatory minimum penalties. And right now, there are not specific numeric effluent limits in either of those permits related to pesticides. So they wouldn't be subject to minimum mandatory penalties. So the reason that Dan's response there's prosecutorial discretion is that, yes, if we found pesticides in the Susan River or in the Mojave River, or we found it in the groundwater associated with the wastewater discharges, we would treat that pollutant as we treat any other pollutant that we are concerned about. That, in other words, if you find it in the groundwater and it's at a level that is above toxic amounts or violates an MCL or is just there, a trace amount would be effectively in violation of our basin plan and the permit requirement. So we would let them know that there's a violation, that we found trace amounts of pesticides in the groundwater, and we'd require that they investigate it. Depending, I mean, if it was just a very small amount, it only was found one time and never again, we would take no action, no further action.
And because it's an NPDES permit, would they be vulnerable to third-party lawsuits?
I don't know. I would have to defer to the attorneys on that. But I think that in general, because of the way those permits are written now, I mean, they currently say you can't discharge in toxic amounts. And then what this is doing is it's saying you can't discharge those pollutants to water. So that would be the groundwater or the surface water. So just because it was found in the effluent, if it wasn't found in the groundwater, that wouldn't be a problem. Or if it was found one time and then never again, it wouldn't be a problem. So I don't know if Michael can add to how that would work on third-party lawsuits.
Notwithstanding, as I read the TriTech and CASA letter, essentially what they're asking for is an exemption for trace amounts and specific implementation authority, if you will, for a narrative effluent limitation. I think even absent any explicit language within the Basin Plan Amendment, as the Regional Board goes about revising the NPDES permits for those two facilities, they have flexibility in terms of how they express the Basin Plan prohibition, especially since at this point in time they're not requiring monitoring. I have to admit, as I look at what the amendment does and the way the existing Basin Plan reads for this region, it seems like that this is an issue that, to the extent that CASA and TriTech are raising it, is almost already present, because the existing Basin Plan specifies water quality objectives that are non-detect for all of these same pesticides. And all of the regional boards, when they issue NPDES permits, have a blanket requirement to comply with water quality objectives. So in many respects, this is just a different way of approaching the issue, and the hypothetical problem that's being presented in CASA and TriTech's letter has been there since the 70s. So, from my perspective, to the
and I think that's the argument. The pesticide, even though there's a prohibition, the use and discharge has been there for a while, and hence this amendment. And so what CASA is asking for is that they be included. I agree. They are already present. That discharge is already there.
Well, I guess I see an important difference in the sense that the Basin Plan Amendment is designed to address those specific activities where there actually is a need to discharge aquatic pesticides for public health, safety, the reasons enumerated in the Basin Plan objective, whereas this truly is a hypothetical, because at this point in time we don't have any indication, at least as I understand it, that there are these trace pesticides present.
And I think Michael's point about it being, this Basin Plan Amendment is only granting exemptions for aquatic pesticides. So our board recognized that terrestrial pesticides and household commonly used pesticides are used in the environment, and our board made a decision not to address that. In other words, they didn't want to provide a process to allow those pesticides to be found in water, because they are inherently not to be found in water. I mean, the labels talk about that. You avoid contact with water. I mean, I recognize it
Just
happens.
because you don't look for it doesn't mean it's not there.
Well, I'm not saying that we don't. I know it's there, and people use it, and they they discharge this, in their toilets and whatever down the drain. But recognizing that that's against the label, that's against the allowable authorized use. So again, I think the best approach is to say it's not appropriate to be found in water, and if it is found in water, we want to use our enforcement authorities to address it if it's a concern. If it's a one-time thing and it never shows up again, it hasn't had an effect. But if it's a persistent thing, then we want to work with the sanitation agencies to do education and outreach to try to prevent this material from being discharged down the toilet. No different than pharmaceuticals or anything else that we've taken an aggressive approach to try to educate the public about how to handle those materials. They don't belong in water.
And the only thing I would add would circle back to the way that I introduced this idea is the idea that even absent any explicit implementation language in the provision, when the regional board goes about reissuing those 2 NPDES permits, they do have flexibility, and I think in many respects that's the best forum to kind of ferret out how best to either go through a trigger approach like CASA and TriTech are proposing in their letter, where it triggers off of acute or chronic toxicity, and then from there perhaps express it as a narrative effluent limitation.
And can we make that, what Mr. Lawford just said, the response to 1.4 instead of what is currently the response to 1.4?
Essentially, that we would say that the
permits,
that we would handle their concerns during permit reissuance.
Thank you.
Are there any further questions on comments and responses as we take this pause? Okay. I'm going to address our CEQA document then, the substitute environmental document. Since the intent of a pesticide is to kill organisms, it's really not surprising that during the course of our environmental review, we found the potential for significant impacts to occur. We know our action may allow the implementation of projects that will likely violate water quality standards in the short term and potentially have impacts to non-target biological resources. In addition, discharge of aquatic pesticides may have significant indirect effects on humans, such as temporary loss of recreational opportunities or even a temporary interruption of domestic supply. Because the amendment may result in these unavoidable, potentially significant impacts, the Lahontan Board adopted a statement of overriding considerations explaining the acceptability of these impacts in light of the project's benefits. The statement finds that the long-term benefits provided to the environment through control of aquatic invasive species and restoring endangered species, and benefits provided to the people of California, such as public health and safety through vector control and safe drinking water, outweigh and render acceptable the potential significant impacts associated with projects allowed under this amendment. So in closing, we recommend the board approves the amendment to the Lahontan Basin Plan. Staff will then submit the amendment to the Office of Administrative Law in the United States EPA for final approval. We hope you support our recommendation, and now we'd like to turn it over to you, the floor, back to the board for questions.
Thank you, Daniel. Ted Thayer, would you like to come forward, please?
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the board. My name is Ted Thayer. I'm the Aquatic Invasive Species Program Coordinator for the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency. And I'd like to speak on behalf of my agency this morning. The Tahoe Regional Planning Agency, among other roles, is the lead agency for the oversight of the Lake Tahoe Aquatic Invasive Species Management Plan. In that role, the TRPA supports this proposed amendment to the Lahontan Basin Plan. While the control of aquatic invasive species is definitely a priority for our agency, we do not take the use of pesticides lightly, and this plan addresses, through the prohibition with exemption criteria, this amendment will provide the appropriate protection to the environment while providing the potential for another tool that we can use to protect our lake from aquatic invasive species. And I would like to further say just that this Basin Plan Amendment does follow along in coordination with the existing Tahoe Regional Planning Agency code in this area. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Thayer. Madonna Dunbar. We built that just for you.
Yeah, I guess so. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the Water Board. My name is Madonna Dunbar. I'm the Executive Director of the Tahoe Water Suppliers Association, and I'm also the Resource Conservationist for the Incline Village General Improvement District. This morning I'm speaking with you on behalf of the Tahoe Water Suppliers Association. First, we would like to acknowledge the very professionalism and the hard work of the Lahontan Water Board staff. They've worked very closely with the water providers through this process. They followed the direction that they were given from their board, and they worked very closely with us, as I said, to develop language that now does include a strong notification process for any of the potentially affected Tahoe water suppliers to vet in on that process. However, at this time, the Tahoe Water Suppliers Association Board would again request the California State Water Board reconsider our initial appeal of a 5-year moratorium on pesticide and herbicide application projects at Lake Tahoe. We continue to support the exceptions to a moratorium for state-declared aquatic invasive species emergency or for the land-based vector control projects that are currently existing primarily for mosquito control. We made this request to the Lahontan Board through the review process, and that was not accepted by the Lahontan Board, so we are now asking you to reconsider that as you move the plan forward. The Tahoe Water Suppliers Association is composed of 12 of the larger community water systems at Lake Tahoe. They're both in California and in Nevada. 6 of the members hold a rather rare exemption for filtration status. It's called filtration exemption status from the US EPA. It means we don't have to filter the water. Only very minimal disinfection is required before it's distributed to the public in the municipal water systems. This status is fairly rare. It's especially rare in a watershed with multiple uses such as Lake Tahoe. There are 6 filtration exempt systems at Tahoe. There are only 60 in the entire country out of 160,000 public water systems. For the past 10 years, as part of the EPA requirement on filtration exempt systems, Tahoe Water Supplier Association staff has produced a watershed control program annual report. The report summarizes the member agencies' water quality testing results every year. We have some of the finest drinking water in the world at Lake Tahoe with a very long history of very few waterborne contaminants. The association in the past 5 years has developed a very strong outreach campaign linked to the protection of Lake Tahoe as a source of drinking water for thousands of residents and hundreds of thousands of visitors every year. Our messages include protect the source and drink Tahoe tap. We've worked very hard to counter what is a national trend of declining consumer confidence in drinking water quality. Other locations in our nation are facing dealing with industrial contaminants, agricultural runoff, pharmaceuticals, and other chemical contaminants. Lake Tahoe is one of the finest sources of water in the world that does not have these materials in them at this point in any quantity, any large quantity. In recognition of this effort, the Tahoe Water Supplier Association has received 3 awards in the past 5 years from the American Water Works Association for source water protection programs being reported through that annual report and the efforts at Lake Tahoe. As you know, Tahoe is a Tier 3 outstanding national resource water. It's the highest designation of a protected water in the United States. There's been billions of dollars spent at Lake Tahoe to improve water quality by both federal, state, regional, and private entities. We've got extensive stormwater pollution controls. We've got an export ban on wastewater to be pumped out of the basin. We've got restrictions and recommendations on land-based chemical and herbicide use. We've got limits on development for coverage. We've got restrictions on the type of industry that's allowed, and there are a host of other actions. The construction of the Tahoe Keys impacted the largest wetlands that serve Lake Tahoe for watershed protection. And this location is now one of the driving forces for the proposed use of aquatic pesticides. Outstanding national resource water bodies, the designation offers special protection where all reasonable, cost-effective, best management practices for non-source point controls are required. So this is the requirement for non-source point solution. Our question with the water providers is, We acknowledge there's a very strong review process being developed here with the plan, but why is the temporary degradation from source point chemical use, which could translate into weeks or days or weeks or months of water quality impact, being allowed to be proposed in the basin? Non-chemical methods of aquatic weed control have been tested on a small scale, and we've been involved in some of that process, offering water quality monitoring support on the Asian clam projects. We feel that has not been fully explored in the Keys area or in any other areas of the lake. So we ask you to consider that a 5-year moratorium at Lake Tahoe would create the incentive to fully explore more non-chemical methods. This would also allow for a 5-year period for the Lahontan Board to refine their review process and gather field-tested data on chemical use projects in other more impacted water bodies in the region. The last thing I'd like to mention is that the filtration exempt status of the water providers is not necessarily impacted by small use of chemical applications. However, if we did have water quality impacts that continued, those treatment facilities are not designed to remove chemicals. They're designed to remove biological contaminants. And each community at Lake Tahoe, we had an estimate of about 10-year-old numbers at $10 million per upgrade for water treatment at each small community. So we ask you to consider that when considering the cost effectiveness of the use of chemicals. So at this point, Tahoe, as you know, is known for internationally for its quality, its stunning mountain beauty, and for the cutting-edge research and pollution prevention methods that have been put in place. So we ask you to seriously consider our request again for the moratorium for 5 years. The outstanding national resource water designation is extremely important in this decision, and we thank you for your time.
Ms. Dunbar, I think Ms. Doduk has a question for you, and I do as well.
I understand that when the regional board adopted this, they added some language directing project proponents to coordinate with you, water suppliers and purveyors, when developing their project to make sure that any submittal to the regional boards would address your concerns. If not, then certainly you have the opportunity then to voice them to the regional boards. Please explain to me how that does not satisfy your concerns.
We acknowledge that the staff and the Lahontan Board have been very supportive through this process to involve the water providers. We feel that chemicals put in the water, Lake Tahoe has a huge residence life for the water that's there. 650 to 700 years is the life of some water in Tahoe. So, and yes, Tahoe is very large, but we feel that you're starting out with some of the finest water, the most pure water in the world that has very little influence other than from our land development. That's the main influence on declining water quality in Lake Tahoe. We just feel it's a terrible precedent to set on such a pristine water source. Those sources are so rare in the world. The drinking water industry, it continually faces declining water quality, and we all need to drink water. So, you know, as this moves forward, if you do approve the plan as it is and we're involved, we're going to be pretty stubborn and require tremendous mitigation measures. And one of the concerns for the water providers, especially at Tahoe, is we don't necessarily all have interties to each other. So it's one thing to have written in the regulations that a project proponent will supply drinking water. The reality of it is each of our small systems has maybe about a day's worth of storage. So if there is a project